Good morning. Welcome to your early warning briefing for Tuesday, the 11th of February, 2025. I'm your host, Mark Nielsen. I am joined today by Robert, Jared, and Mike Shelby. We have a lot to cover today, so let's jump right inside the Beltway. Robert, it looks like the Senate is wrangling over a reconciliation bill, and we've also talked about a possible government shutdown and how that's being used. What's going on there?
Good morning, Mark. So it looks like the Senate Budget Committee is scheduled to mark up a reconciliation bill this week, as soon as today, or starting as soon as tomorrow and Thursday. It's going to include $150 billion in defense spending increases and $350 billion in border spending. Right now, it seems like the House Republicans are not in agreement yet on their own side of any reconciliation bills. And the House and the Senate would need to pass the same bill under this reconciliation process. So there just seemed to be some disorganization on the side of the House, and now the Senate is jumping in to try to get something started.
All right, and Robert, also, it looks like the GOP, or we have Republican lawmakers in Congress that are trying to boost nuclear, coal, and gas. What's going on there?
Well, this is a bill being proposed called the Grid Power Act, and it's going to direct the Federal Electricity Reliability Corporation to actually allow grid operators to push dispatchable power projects to the front of the interconnection line. And under this bill, what they mean by dispatchable power sources, what we've talked about, where they define it as any power generation that produces a, quote, known and forecastable electric supply. And this would allow some of these projects that have been talked about, especially the nuclear projects, to jump ahead in the line of like renewable projects that have been basically clogging up these interconnection queues for the grid operators like wind and solar.
All right. And then finally, we've been covering the Trump Resistance 2.0 quite a bit. Mike, I know we've talked about this. You've reported extensively on this, a lot of good analysis, but where are we at with Trump Resistance 2.0 right now?
Yeah, well, we're kind of in the same place that we have been for the past month or so, but I'm seeing the foundations slowly being built here. So by now, everyone knows left-wing reaction to President Trump has so far been much more muted than in 2017. We've seen these grassroots organizations really struggle to gain traction. There have been a lot of protests, but not a lot of protesters compared to 2017. But Democrat and progressive groups are mounting pushback through institutional lawfare, which is legal action and warfare. And I'm seeing these far left groups still largely on the sidelines. So right now, House Democrats are planning to launch more lawsuits against the Trump administration under this Rapid Response Task Force and Litigation Working Group. They launched this organization. They say they're being flooded with calls to their offices demanding that Democrats launch a more determined resistance to Trump and his allies. That's according to Politico. And that actually is true. But the reality is that a relatively small but irate number of progressives actually are flooding House Democrats with phone calls. But there is so far no mainstream outrage over the Trump administration's gutting of federal spending, or at least attempted gutting of federal spending. Protests are attracting hundreds of activists. We're seeing this every day in D.C. now, as opposed to the tens or hundreds of thousands that we saw back in 2017. Also, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries have so far not committed to forcing a government shutdown next month. However, Democrats do appear in the driver's seat there. Republicans are going to need at least 6 Democratic votes in the Senate to pass a debt ceiling increase by the 14th of March. And that's because Republicans, I think, have 53 votes. If all Republicans vote for it, and they need 60 votes to push that through. Now, some Democrats have privately expressed support for shutting down the government as a bargaining chip to kind of rein in the Trump agenda here. But I tell you, a lot of Democrats remain fearful that a shutdown could also bring even more backlash against the Democrats. They remain unpopular as a party. I think one poll had them at like 38% approval rate or something like that. In a Dear Colleagues letter, Schumer outlined a 4-part strategy to resist the Trump administration. It's all political. He wants these spotlight hearings so Congress can conduct oversight over the Trump administration. And he calls for Senate Democrats to support lawsuits and coordinating a coordinated messaging campaign. Now, this is also interesting. CNN had a great article published yesterday, and here's what they have to say. Quote, Democrats have been powerless as they have watched President Donald Trump systematically move to dismantle federal agencies. And one anonymous Democratic senior aide said, quote, there's just not a lot of good options for Democrats here. Indivisible, which is the most prominent Trump resistance grassroots progressive group, launched the Payback Project, and they want to target moderate Republican senators who voted to confirm Russ Vought as OMB director. They say they're funneling organizing efforts into Alaska, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, and North Carolina to target these vulnerable Republicans in midterm elections next year. Remember, they're trying to build a big blue wave for the midterms. That is their near-term goal is to try to stop Trump in the courts wherever they can. But they're putting all their chips in on the midterm elections. And if they, again, I think I said this in previous weeks, if Democrats fail to stop, if Democrats fail to pierce GOP dominance in the House and Senate, it's going to be a very long 2 years for them after a very long 2 years. Midterms are next year, by the way. While most Democrats are urging a political and legal fight against Trump, we have seen some incendiary language used. Representative Jasmine Crockett from up in Dallas said, quote, she said this yesterday, quote, we are going to be in your face. We're going to be on your asses. And we're going to make sure you understand what democracy looks like. So the bottom line here is that the Trump administration the Trump resistance 2.0 is still really trying to find its footing. They're swinging and missing. They have not had an event or development happen that really coalesces mainstream outrage. And so this is a developing political struggle. And my concern is that this could actually escalate into low intensity conflict where we do see acts of political violence or even domestic terrorism. As of right now, the risk of large scale civil unrest, so something on the order of 2020, remains very unlikely. And I've been saying that for the past year plus now, because we've just not seen a level of mobilization. There's just not a mobilization capacity for the left like there was back in 2016 and 2017 and on into 2020. And so I don't expect that to change in the near term. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. The more radical elements, especially the far left revolutionary groups, remain fragmented, although we did see attempts last month to reestablish some of those far left networks and affinity groups that have been largely dormant since 2021. This is also interesting. I talked about this back in 2023. There have been several far left revolutionary groups, like revolutionary leftist anarchist groups, and they have previously pushed for a big tent approach to direct action. And they've wanted to combine these disparate movements under a single revolutionary banner. Under one of these plans, published back in 23, revolutionary anarchists sought to expand their quote-unquote revolutionary struggle by cooperating with labor unions, Black Lives Matter and Black Power groups, and activists from the LGBTQ plus environmentalist and pro-immigration movements. That strategy, at least so far, has not gained any support. So here's where we are. Unless the Trump administration commits some egregious overreach of power that ignites mainstream opposition, the economic health almost certainly remains kind of this linchpin for this anti-Trump sentiment. If we have a financial crisis or recession that substantially increases unemployment, that's going to almost certainly lead to mass protests and a rise in direct action demonstrations. An increase in popular immiseration, maybe as a result of some of these tariffs, if there's tariff-induced economic hardship and inflation, that could also produce widespread popular discontent that would lead to mass mobilization protests. So in my view, the stability of the United States really is resting on this uncertain economy that we have. And that really does represent the biggest risk to the Trump agenda. My last 2 points here. Coming up on Saturday, February 15th, there's a Tesla takeover protest. So a bunch of groups and activists and militants are reportedly planning to protest at Tesla dealerships across the country. And then on the 19th to the 22nd of this month, there's the Crash CPAC protest. So some activists, you can see that in that little poster there, they say, show them our discontent. They'll all be in the same place. So this is the Conservative Political Action Committee conference is coming up it will be at the National Harbor in Maryland, right outside DC. So those are two other things we have to look forward to there, Mark.
All right, thanks, Mike. And this kind of dovetails into the rest of our efforts to map out this Trump resistance 2.0. Over here, we're Early Warning. We've done a lot of work in analyzing this and following this. So if you're a member of Early Warning, you already know this. We've been covering this and we'll continue to do so. But for those of you who are just tuning in, or maybe you're new to Early Warning, you can get access to a lot more coverage on this Trump resistance 2.0 from Mike and from the rest of the team over on the high side. And so to do that, you can need to become a member, and you can jump on a free 7-day trial right now if you go over to earlywarningnetwork.com and become a member today. But we have a lot of great resources. There's a lot of good material, and then we'll be offering additional analysis and insights as we continue on monitoring this Trump administration and these resistance efforts. So please join us over there. All right, thanks, Mike. We are now going to jump into our roll-up for the day. Starting off with some of these ICE raid leaks. What's going on, Robert?
So yesterday, White House border czar Tom Homan said during an interview that leaks of these ICE raids are actually, quote, coming from the inside. And he said that information from some of these leaks points to the FBI. And he said the Department of Homeland Security has identified a suspect in the leak of an ICE raid earlier this year on Aurora, Colorado. And they're currently investigating a possible suspect in the leak of an ICE raid in California. So yeah, it looks like this points to some insider leaks of some of these immigration enforcement efforts.
All right, thanks, Robert. And now let's go over to you, Jared. With our international focus for the roll-up, can you please take us through your items?
Absolutely. So Canada will be joining the Philippines next multilateral maritime cooperative activity next week. And at the same time, the Canadian Embassy announced that they will be finalizing their status of visiting forces agreement this year. Now, all of this pretty much points towards the answer to a question that Mike asked me a couple of weeks ago of, hey, will the Philippines be the heart of any kind of American-led Pacific resistance? The answer is yes here. Taiwan is looking to buy more American liquid natural gas, and this is coming from their Ministry of Economic Affairs. They're doing this explicitly because they want to try to avoid tariffs and reduce their trade deficit. I talked about that a bit yesterday. There is a Russian researcher that came out of a government-funded think tank saying that President Trump's proposal to have Ukraine repay America with rare earth metals and critical minerals is impossible because they require, quote, enormous investments, and most of the deposits are actually in territory now owned by Russia. I'll be keeping an eye on this. The enormous investments part doesn't seem like it'd be too much of an issue for Trump, though. And lastly, in a bit of a surprise, presidents from Mexico, Colombia, and El Salvador applauded President Trump's closure of USAID last week. Leaders from El Salvador and Colombia accused USAID of funding NGOs in their territories and resistance groups.
All right, thanks, Jared. I just want to add a little bit of emphasis on that last roll-up item, and I'm sure we'll continue to monitor this. But, this fight over USAID is really interesting. We're going to see a lot of information coming out from these types of reactions in the international community on how USAID is viewed from abroad. I think, Robert, it might have been you, maybe Jared, pardon if I've messed that up, but I know that we talked about how global leaders will often be more truthful on the international stage, or at least when communicating with one another, versus how they convey this information to their domestic audience. I think that underscores this point we're making here. It will be very interesting to see how the American people, what they learn about USAID, how it's perceived around the world, and some of those strings attached as we move forward. We'll continue to monitor this, but I do think that reaction from those Latin American leaders is significant, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing a little bit more about what USAID has been up to with our tax dollars. All right, now let's move on to our warning items for the day. Starting off with you, Robert. I know we've talked a lot about how the last administration deputized IRS agents. Now, you had a really interesting insight on how this could impact immigration enforcement under the Trump administration. What's going on there?
Yeah, so apparently a memo has been put out that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem actually asked Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to deputize IRS criminal investigators with the idea that they're going to investigate financial transactions related to human trafficking networks and businesses that employ illegal immigrants. And I thought this was interesting because on the surface, this adds to the immigration enforcement efforts from the Trump administration. But I think this is a pretty shrewd strategic political move by the Trump administration, because it also serves as kind of a filter for reliability of actually enforcing the Trump administration's agenda. Right. So he's taking these IRS criminal investigators and putting them on immigration enforcement. So, it kind of acts as a filter where those who are politically disinclined to work on immigration, could resign. But I think also occupies a federal agency that could otherwise be used by Democrats to undermine the Trump administration, because they'll be busy, doing these criminal investigations on human trafficking and illegal immigration employment.
All right. And Robert, also, could you give us an update on what's going on with Trump steel tariffs?
Yeah, so yesterday, President Donald Trump signed orders under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, imposing 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports into the U.S. beginning on the 4th of March. And these tariffs are also going to impact finished products. And a senior Trump official said that these new tariffs are needed because steel and aluminum exporters were abusing previous import policies to hurt U.S. producers. In the immediate term, this is going to impose direct cost increases on steel and aluminum imports. However, it's likely we'll also see price and supply chain disruptions for goods manufactured in the U.S. and even certain services, including construction. And, there are some key manufacturing that relies on aluminum that was already experiencing disruptions, like electrical equipment production. I've also seen where border states are warning that local manufacturing bases are going to take a hit when these additional tariffs on imports from Mexico take effect on the 4th of March, in addition to these steel and aluminum tariffs. And then there has been some talk from ag economists that are warning that foreign trade partners like China are already diversifying their own supply chains away from American exports in retaliation. So it's going to make getting a trade deal that will walk back these tariffs more difficult.
All right. Thanks, Robert. All right, Jared, let's shift over now to our global focus here with these warning items. Could you please walk us through what's going on your side of the fence today?
Absolutely. So NATO kicked off a 10,000 troop exercise in Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania yesterday. The exercise will focus on, quote, the execution of a pre-crisis multi-domain activity that aims to reinforce the allied forces. Bulgaria, France, Greece, Italy, Romania, Spain, Slovenia, and Turkey, and the UK are all participating with all of their armed forces, so Army, Navy, Air Force, as well as Spec Ops. Now, the reason this is important is obviously this is a pretty significant movement of troops. It's the largest exercise they've got scheduled for 2025. But it's important to note that Romania is actually due to have a 10,000-man NATO base on its coast come up here in the next year or two. So this may actually offer cover to deliver troops and equipment over to that base and establish a much larger presence there on the Black Sea.
Okay, and Jared, finally, the last item here, and I would really like to get a little additional insight. I think a lot of us who aren't familiar with some of these practices abroad might have a little confusion on what the significance of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is. As I understand it, President Trump just signed an executive order related to that. Could you please walk us through that and explain why it matters?
Yes. So the big takeaway here is that what this is doing is removing the barrier for bribing foreign officials, which really it's not necessarily just bribing, but being caught up in things that aren't bribes that could be taken as bribes. This will remove a lot of barriers for businesses and politics to actually take place overseas. Long-term China watchers have noted that China's diplomacy frequently includes open bribes for businesses and political favors. There was a Pacific Island, I think 2 years ago, where shortly, this was coming from, again, long-term China watchers. They pointed out, we saw a massive drop of cash into his bank account, and then he switched recognition from Taiwan to China. So what this is going to do is allow American businesses and politicians to compete on an even playing field, particularly in the Pacific.
So, Jared, we had a question in the chat. I think you'd be best suited to answer this. Ben asked, some say that the United States is losing soft power and influence to China in areas like Cambodia, Southeast Asia in general, with these USAID cuts. So will the temporary suspension of foreign support impact U.S. influence abroad? How does that relate to what we're talking about here?
I think it will have some moderate impact. You mentioned Cambodia, and that's actually a great example because USAID was very invested in the agricultural industry there. However, one thing to keep in mind is that USAID was supposed to be rolled up into the State Department, who will they are the entity for diplomacy. So they'll likely continue to do things that are that benefit America, that make it safer, stronger, more prosperous. However, what we're seeing, I think, here is a shift from not soft power in the idea of spreading progressivism, but soft power as it's meant to be, where you help somebody establish an industry so they become dependent on American technology, or maybe you say you come in and allow them to have their sovereignty ensured by you providing police training or military training, or maybe even a semi-permanent military presence. That's something that we've been talking about here on the show for Greenland. They don't have the ability to defend themselves. So even though it kind of blurred the line between soft power and hard power, being able to say, hey, we'll ensure your sovereignty, we just don't have it. With our military, that would be a great way to exercise it. And that's not coming through USAID.
So, Jared, overall, this executive order, which really does make a major change to how foreign policy is conducted abroad. Do you feel like this is directly targeted to China, or, do you think that it has broader implications? I know that you've touched on some other areas, but it seems to me like this appears to be most targeted towards the way that China conducts its foreign policy.
I would say China is definitely the main target. It will have some ramifications for others, but China's it. When you listen to panels for people that actually are in the State Department, they're never bringing up like India or Russia. They're going, no, China is just buying friends. So we need to, if they're going to be mercenary, fine, we can be mercenary too.
Fascinating. Well, thank you, Jared. Appreciate the insight on that. It looks like we just have just one last question in the chat that we could probably get to. This is coming from Bad Wabbit, asking about an incident in Ohio yesterday where a group, it looked like a white supremacist or neo-Nazi group, went into a black neighborhood and with possibly the intention to provoke. The question that's being asked is, do we see more of this in the future? Can you speak a little bit about this? Jared, I think you had a little bit of insight on where this happened. Could you maybe add your perspective here?
Sure. Just briefly, it was down in a suburb of Cincinnati, and appeared to be a result of a group similar to Patriot Front. I didn't see exactly who it was, but I know Patriot Front does have a presence here in Ohio. They show up right outside their state house a few times.
Okay, so yeah, I think what we usually see is we see that these groups tend to come and go. A lot of fluctuation in where they appear and when they appear, tend to catch a lot of media presence. But from what we've seen and what we focus on over here, especially this low intensity conflict, it mostly seems to be PR stunts, or at least to galvanize, attention. But there seems to be very little coordination or any action beyond that. And so I'm sure, to answer the question, I'm sure that there is actually, this will provoke people. This will probably garner a small media firestorm. But generally, these things don't really amount to much more than that. Robert, do you have a perspective on this at all? I'd be curious about your take on some of these actions on the right, at least.
Hey, Mark, why don't you let me at it for a second here?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So listen, I think they're called the Blood Tribe or something like that. It's a neo-Nazi group, and they have held previous demonstrations like this. I don't know if this was exactly Blood Tribe, but they're kind of dressed the same here. We've seen this for many years now. Probably going back to like the alt-right movement, white nationalist movement back in 2015 and in 2016. So to answer the question, like, can we expect more of this in the future? Yeah, I don't see why not. These actions are obviously designed to provoke and pick up news coverage. We've seen Patriot Front do this as well. There's a big freak out in the media, and they talk about this group, and then a bunch of disillusioned, white guys go search for this group and start reading their social media or their websites, and and they're like, it's a recruiting tool. This is something that I don't know if the media understands this or not, but they're just trying to get media coverage because a lot of them have been deplatformed from social media accounts. So they need a way to stay relevant, to stay in the news cycle, so that people so they're generating awareness and trying to stay relevant. I don't see why this would not continue to happen in the future. And so Yeah, I would think if you live in an area like this where you do have active groups, this is something that you should be aware of. This kind of stuff should be in your area study also. You should be aware that you do have both uh, white nationalists or neo-Nazi and black power groups in your area. And so, this is an area where actually low intensity conflict could potentially take off, kind of a left field thing where we might actually have actual conflict, armed conflict potentially, or some form of violent conflict between these groups.
All right. Thanks for that perspective, Mike. All right. Well, that does it for today's early warning briefing. We really do appreciate you joining us and all your support. As always, you can expect today's report in your inbox later today, and we will be back here at 08 Central Time for tomorrow's briefing. Thank you again for tuning in. If you, as we said before, if you're new to this, if you're new to the briefing and you want more access to some of the reporting and analysis that we've done over on the high side, please pop over to Early Warning Network. We have a free 7-day trial there for you. So once again, have a great day. Thank you for all your support. And as always, stay out front.